I've worked in natural resource management for the federal government and different agencies and did a lot of environmental mediation work for the federal government. I'm now retired and making good trouble now.
We've got three Michael and Michaels. Next one on my list is Mike Recklin.
All right, I'm in Franklin, West Virginia, and I work with Future Generations University down here. And I work with basically my friends and neighbors who are in the maple syrup business or trying to get into it down in these rural communities.
Michael Sue.
Hi, I'm Michael Sue. I live in Los Angeles, and I'm trying to get better at engaging people who may disagree with me strenuously in order to get better conversations and get them to at least find a middle ground. I would like to continue pursuing a political career. So this is why I'm here. Thank you.
Good to see you. We worked together at my first law firm. And Rohan.
Hello, good evening. I am from Guyana on the northern tip of the South American continent. I'm also an alum of Future Generations. I think that would have been the 2011 class, if I remember correctly. Mike Recklin might be able to correct me on that. Most of my work here in Guyana, yes, I've been involved with our indigenous peoples who live out in the deeper hinterlands, close in the Amazon jungle and closer to the equator. And also I've primarily in the area of ethnomusicology and education.
Welcome, very good to see
Thank
you.
you.
Carol, we're just doing very brief introductions. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a former science teacher, a retired science teacher, and my science specialty was climate change. So I worked at the Ohio State University's Berg Polar Research Center for climate, and after I retired from teaching, and I've retired to Tennessee. So I'm just I grew up in a very small community in Northwest Wisconsin, very rural, and the biggest town was like 1,000 people. so I understand the rural urban thing.
Sure. Great to have all of you here. I've been very excited to do these small groups. I've loved what's been in the chat every session, such good discussion in the chat. So to me, one of the keys when we're thinking about speaking and acting differently is that if you make a change at that level, you've got to kind of always police yourself. And it's this harder work of making a deeper change in our thinking that, if we can do that, shows up in the way that we speak and act as well. So some of our concrete steps might be less concrete than in the other groups, just by virtue of we're talking about thoughts. But I'm really excited to brainstorm with all of you some concrete steps that we can really take away from these sessions. I want to spend about 5 minutes, very short, talking about sort of the challenges that we've found just in all of our own lives in the way that we think about this rural-urban divide. I think by way of example, and this is universally true beyond even the rural-urban divide, but we all bring with us our past experiences to every interaction we have. And a lot of times that can cause us to import a lot of assumptions about people to our new conversations. So what are some things that all of you have found in your conversations across this divide that are kind of challenges? Before we step into the solutions, let's talk just very briefly about the challenges.
Hi, Cody, if I may go first.
Of course.
Yes, I think it was the second webinar. It was mentioned that urban people tend to think of rural folks as being, I think the word that was used was, stupid, or lacking that education and that level of um, sophistication that or urban people tend to think that they possess. And although he was, I think it was Anthony, although he was describing the urban-rural condition in the United States, that very statement um, we can connect with and to here in Guyana.
Sure.
Yeah, because it's precisely, if we frame it in the way Anthony framed it, it's exactly word for word here in Guyana. The urban people tend to think that the hinterland or the rural people in Guyana, just doesn't um, doesn't have it, that it can be looked at being on the same level, whether it's in academia, whether it's in professionalism. I think the reference was made, I think, to teachers. It's the same framework that exists here in Guyana that was described in that, I think, second webinar.
It's a really universal, not just an American thing, but
Correct, yes.
yeah, very interesting. Anybody else with some thoughts about what are the knots that we encounter in the thinking around this issue?
I think where I am in rural Northeast Oregon, it has expressed itself a lot politically. Rural Oregon, Eastern Oregon is quite conservative, generally Republican, strongly Republican leaning, but the population is on the west side, more Democratic, more liberal. They have the power in the state legislature. So the Eastern Oregonians on the more conservative side of things tend to feel marginalized, not listened to. And yet, at the local levels, they obviously run things because it's home rule and they have control over local decisions, but I think they feel somewhat powerless at the statewide level. And that has been obviously playing out a lot in the more recent times with the presidential elections and all the Republican Democratic divide going on. So it has a lot of political overtones.
That is so similar to where we are.
Gina,
I got to say that Washington, the divide seems very similar to Oregon. And even though I'm on the west side, the southwest part of our state is quite rural, so and quite Republican, got to say. And it seems like one thing that kind of bothers me is, I don't know if, I mean, I grew up rural, but it just seems like there's a different kind of a social structure that seems to play out a lot of times, to my way of thinking. There's this whole property rights thing, which is like, get off my property. I own the air. I own this stuff on my property. And whereas in more urban areas, it seems like there's, maybe it's just my naivety, but it seems like there's more of a sharing thing. You live closer together, you have to get along with people who are different from you. But in rural places, it's like, I'm going to put a gate on, I'm going to put a big fence on. And there's that kind of thing, which just kind of drives me crazy.
I kind of disagree with that. Okay. Rural folks, they cooperate all the time. They help each other make hay. They, if your cow gets out of your pasture, I'll put it back in. They are really cooperative. Where I see what you're talking about is in suburban culture. When I lived in in outside of St. Louis, the gated communities, those were the suburban, the wealthier, the quote unquote better educated communities were gated, not where I live now. I don't lock my house.
I think I agree with what you're saying, and I do see that a lot of it is like, I don't know, bedroom communities or something where people all actually work and spend most of their time in a larger town. So I totally agree with you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting back and forth. I mean, we could spend a lot of time on that. I've seen that. I've seen both of those things, and it I think it may have to do some with what people's relationship to the land is. When you're working it, when you're farming it, there is a lot of back and forth and sharing. Whereas if you are just sort of like going out to be alone, there's that component as well. That's very interesting. Anybody else with a burning desire to talk about the challenges? If not, I hate to rush us because we really could spend all day here, but we should get to solutions here soon.
Cody, I have one challenge I want to mention really quickly. Thanks for the invitation. I lived in Seattle for about 12 years. There was one of my best friends where I worked was from Yakima, and he and his family, I used to play softball with them. And when we had conversations about politics, the challenge for me was what I perceived from him was a very hyper emasculating style of engaging with me and my ideas and things that I was concerned with. There's this idea of there was a more masculine approach that he was promoting and believed in versus whatever I was doing, which is some kind of overthinking, possibly effete persona. That's probably the wrong word, but that was a challenge for me, was overcoming that. And it was kind of intimidating too. So there's that.
Yeah, that's great. And I've got a lot of experience in the room dealing with this. What's the experience of people here in working through our own thinking? How do we think differently to deal with these issues across the divide?
Can I raise a point?
Yeah,
as I taught high school science classes in a suburban area, my students often felt like I explained about my farm background and how my parents believed their farm was their retirement. So like they didn't put money away to be able to live. They worked hard to create and upgrade and improve the farm so that it would sell enough at some point that they could then live off that. And so, and it's continuously gotten worse in the sense that a lot of people can't do that. So they wind up having to work literally into their 80s, which is, it's a way of life. It's not really a job you sign out, you can clock out. So my students, the reason I bring this point up is because my students, having lived in suburbia and with basically professional parents, basically said, well, your parents should have thought of that and they should have put money aside so that they could have a retirement. And they just didn't grasp that the farmer's income is not so much dependent upon what they do, but about the market and about disasters and all these things. So I believe that's a huge challenge for people who have never experienced living with the whims of weather and depending upon that. And so anyway, that I guess I would say I found it difficult to discuss that in a good way with my students because they literally couldn't conceive of why a person who owned a farm and had animals and whatever shouldn't be able to put money away.
One of my early history professors asked the class, why do we study history? And the classic answer is to avoid repeating the past. But sometimes a better one, and I think in this context, a much better one, is so that we can be empathetic to people. We can understand their story, what they've gone through, where they've come from. And when I'm thinking about like concrete solutions to the divide, I think actually just reading, pretty simple thing, but reading stories about people who have different backgrounds can help us have a different reference group and a different understanding. If you read a story about somebody who's farmed and been subject to the whims of weather that way, you're coming from a very different place and are much more capable of being empathetic.
I think most people have a reason for doing what they do. And you know, if you come from a very different background, you know, you're approaching it from your own perspective, and you can't like, why are these people doing this? This does not make any sense. But the challenge, I think, is to put yourself in their situation and be able to elicit and listen and hear, you know, them explain why they're doing what they're doing, what beliefs it's based on, what assumptions it's based on, and it's not illogical. It's just it's on a different basis perhaps than you.
Yeah, listening, key. Erica talked about coming from a place of curiosity in her session, and I think there's you know, a lot of humility. I think there's, you know, sort of three important mindsets. Curiosity is one of them. Humility is another, and presence, just being present with somebody, is another one. Coming to a conversation with the attitude of what can I learn? And sometimes a way to do that across the divide is by thinking differently about the objective of the interaction. A lot of times we come, especially in politics, for instance, we come to an interaction with the objective of persuasion. I'm going to persuade this person to think like me. One of the things that I've done to try to get myself out of that mindset is think, no, my objective really is to build a relationship with this person, to connect with this person. And I found that puts me into the posture of curiosity and humility better than anything else. It's about thinking about what's my objective here.
I love that, curiosity and humility, because yeah.
I would also add, I guess, that I have a dear neighbor who's close to us, helps us often. We help him. We are just about polar opposites in terms of our approaches to what we perceive as problems. And I wind up having to think of him as such a good grandparent, you know, like he does so many things absolutely antithetical to whatever I would ordinarily think, that I sometimes think, you know, I admire, he's a great grandparent and he is very capable. He does a lot of things, he makes things and whatever. So, you know, it's just, sometimes I've actually had to go that level, you know, to just be able to be on the same page with him. Anyway, I just think it's kind of comical how that, I guess it's an empathy almost, like kind of like I honor his humanity, you know, and we still get along and we trade services and do things for one another and whatever, but it's just sometimes I need to put myself back in that, you know, what do I really like about John?
Do you feel that he does similarly with you?
I am not so sure. Not so sure. He doesn't, let's see, I want to say he doesn't do put downs, but he makes kind of jokes that are pointed kind of, but you know, like it's done well. It's some humor.
I have a question. Some of the people in this discussion group are people who've retired and moved to rural areas from less rural areas. And I don't know if this is something you run across where you live, but I live in a town in Utah that's surrounded by public lands. And so a lot of the people who move here as retirees are people who move here because they're hikers, mountain bikers, outdoor enthusiasts. And it's you know, I live in Utah. This was a town settled initially by Moran pioneers, and a lot of the longtime residents, they're multi-generational descendants of the pioneers. And so I'm one of those people that moved here from somewhere else, and I'm an outdoor person. So I hang out with the people who do the hiking and my activities make it so that I hang out with the group of move-ins. I'm the move-ins, right? But I did a lot of research here, and I know a lot more about the area history, people's family history. I know a lot more people than they do. And I find that my friends, and so I understand a lot better where the people who live here are coming from. But my friends, the people I hang out with, are always putting the people who live here down.
Mm.
I mean, it's painful to me. I can't even engage in a conversation with them to try to represent what I think is their point of view, or try to open up their mind to some of the history that happened in the area. And it's a situation where, I mean, I don't know if this is, so I see my friends as a big part of the problem, because they are so closed-minded. They have no interest in learning about the people who live here, who have an amazing history. And I don't know if that's an issue with other people who've moved into rural areas, that maybe you hang out with the more recent people who move in because that's what you share interests with them. I don't know, but this is a big issue for me. It's painful. I can't sit there and argue with this whole group of people, right? And they're so close-minded. I don't know, anyway, I just wonder if someone else might have had an experience like that and have something to contribute.
Just a warning, we've only got about 90 seconds before they're
Oh.
going to pull us back in. So I see Mike is chomping at the bit. Go ahead.
Like to say, I work with folks who all have Trump bumper stickers. Okay, every one of them, and I don't go at it with trying to convince them that they're wrong. Okay, I think it gets down to how you engage with your community. If you're just hanging out with the mountain bike crew, and I just got off a 5-hour mountain bike today, you're missing part of your community. Get yourself involved with the library, get yourself involved with what the people who are not the outsiders are involved with, and develop that mutual respect at that level. When I started down here, I used to say there's nothing more useless in the woods than a Yankee with a PhD. Okay, and I've gone from being that Yankee with a PhD to being the guy who shows up and says, hey, we could do this and you could make more money, okay? Because your trees would give more sap, and we could do this sustainable forestry thing, and it's going to be a benefit. So what you give, I think, is very important to how you approach your community.
Now, there's going to be an opportunity, I think, for some follow-up sessions. If you want to kind of bring this training back to your local communities, there's going to be an opportunity for that in the resource. Also, the resource sheet that we're going to send out later, do look for some good resources about this. And I'll put my personal email in there as well. If any of you want to dialogue about this afterwards, I'm happy to do that. Wonderful to see you all and to hear from you.
We have 84 seconds.
Any last minute thoughts?
Yeah.
Mike, I love that last point. I wrote it down as try to cross-pollinate with folks in your community, not just the newcomers, but or if you're an old timer there, maybe some of the newcomers.
Here in Upper East Tennessee, the Sears salesman asked me if I'd found my church family yet. So that's an easy way around here to make a connection.
Sure. Yeah, here too. Any last minute thoughts? This was a good discussion.
Just playing on that last comment, a good way to really get to know your community is attend every church supper.
Yeah.
And not only will you be really well fed, but you'll get to meet a lot of folk.
I'll include that in the,
Right.
oh, go ahead.
Mike,